Welcome to Side Hustle. Hello, everyone. This is Eric.
And this is Eli.
We're chatting about the game design goals we've developed in the course of our research on the main show, Jianghu Hustle. This time we're talking about something you've heard a lot about on both shows, scale.
That's right. We're talking scale. We want to know who's the most powerful, who's the weakest of the weaklings. And this is actually inspired by a bit of mail that we got from one of our listeners, Andreas Devore.
All right, so let's just read Andreas's comment here real quick. And then he brings up a bunch of interesting things, and we're just going to bounce off of this for our discussion. So Andreas says, "You've been talking about scale since way back, and clearly you find it a key point to your understanding of the genre. I have not been as keen on the concept, and my thoughts crystallized after your conversation from episode 26. I'm starting to think that maybe some of the rules of a wuxia game is not about what happened during play, but what happened setting up for the game. Think back to your conversations about how scales seem to decide who can defeat whom, and how it defines how some characters act. I guess the basic question is if this is something that is known in the setting itself. I'm just now reading Smiling Proud Wanderer, the novel the Laughing in the Wind TV series is based on. You remember how they debated who was what ranking when they were fighting sitting down? In the later chapters, Ling Hu Chong, the hero of the sitting down fight, basically calls the idea of an official ranking ludicrous and admits he just made it up as a fast-talking maneuver. Considering how heavy the shadow of D&D falls over all gaming, I sometimes think we see levels where there are none. Well, just some thoughts on my end. Very entertaining and illuminating episode as always. Cheers." Well, thanks, Andreas.
Yeah, I appreciate a lot of those insights, especially the bit about how Andreas has been reading Smiling Proud Wanderer. I would love to get my hands on a translation of that book.
Yeah, that would be pretty good. I know that there's some like fan translations and stuff out there, but I'm always a little leery. So if people have recommendations for good ones, that would be great. Also, you too can send us comments and questions and queries and various things at our email address, jianghuhustle@gmail.com. Just like Andreas did. Or you can submit them to the Patreon at patreon.com/jianghuhustle.
Or even send us a DM at Jianghu Hustle on Twitter.
Oh, cut it out. Now you're just goofing. I'm just kidding. So let's talk about scale. All right. You got some stuff kind of broken down here in the notes here. So why don't you tell me what you've got, and then we can kind of riff back and forth about what you have and what Andreas was saying to us earlier.
Yeah, so I kind of want to explore this in 3 dimensions, or along 3 spectra. The first one is games and levels. The second one is wuxia and power. And the third one is wuxia and games, because Andreas covers a lot of stuff along all 3 of those lines, and I think it's going to make for some really cool discussion. Mm-hmm. To start off, games and levels. Andreas is absolutely right. The shadow of D&D falls heavily, and D&D is a level-based system. There are discrete units of power that you travel through in that game. And I think part of the reason why is because advancement helps you to explore longer-term play. There's been some conversation about this on Twitter recently about, if you're going to play a campaign, do you really need advancement? And the answer seems to be, well, if you're the type of person who likes advancement, then yeah, sure you do. Which I realize isn't very helpful, but
almost tautological.
Yeah, one might say. Yeah, I think generally speaking, if you are going to be telling a story for a long time, you want that story to go somewhere. And advancement is one way that the mechanics interact with the story to help it feel like it's going somewhere. It's not the only way, maybe not the best way, but it is certainly one way.
Well, and there are different, I think we're going to get into this with the next thing, but there are different ways of advancing. It's not always just the personal power that we see in D&D.
Yeah, Powered by the Apocalypse games are a good example. Instead of getting more and more powerful as you progress through the game, you're instead fulfilling more and more of an archetype or a niche in the narrative. And, some folks who really like advancement really prefer D&D advancement and really don't like PBTA style advancement, and vice versa. Some folks love PBTA advancement and some folks don't like D&D. I think for me, that's really informative for wuxia, because when advancement isn't rigid, we're talking about, or so far in the history of this show, we've talked about scale as kind of this absolute marker, and you cannot contend with people who are above your scale. PBTA sort of, its advancement model would contradict that. I don't think that would be a good model for what we've been describing so far.
I would agree, because PBTA tends to be like fairly constrained, just mechanically as far as like one character's power over another character's power, though, because it deals so much with narrative framing and that sort of positioning, that you can actually give characters a thing that just happens within the fiction that is maybe technically overpowered.
Sure. Like in D&D, you've got that base attack bonus, and that's going to rise every time you get a level up. If you're some classes, it's going to be more shallow with other classes, but regardless, a level 1 character is going to have a much smaller base attack bonus than a level 20 character. Right. And with Powered by the Apocalypse games, you are giving yourself more options, more levers that you can use to pull on the narrative. But if you get all of the moves in your playbook, you're not going to be a huge amount more powerful than you were right when you started out. Well,
I think it's a little more nuanced than that. Because there is the ability to create custom moves, or let's say we had a custom wuxia game, right? Or we had a move in the game that says when, like, and this is a new one that I take, right? I advance. I'm just a regular, cool sort of mid-level wuxia fighter, and then I learn the iron body technique, and so I get the move iron body technique, and it says when people attack you with regular weapons, they do not roll.
Okay.
They don't roll to attack.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because we've now changed the fictional positioning in such a way that now you are, in one particular very specific narrative way, you are very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Because moves don't always have to be like roll some dice and see what happens.
Right.
They're just structured if this, then that.
Yeah. So in the context of the wuxia ideas that we've been kicking around, that would be considered a specific kind of scale booster.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, if somebody comes at you with a unarmed strike, or if somebody tries to attack you by running you over with a cart or something like that, your iron body is not guaranteed to be effective. But if they come at you with weapons, then you are operating from a place of increased scale.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So we can see that neither one of them necessarily lines up with kind of what we're talking about with scale. And I think part of that is because it is a little bit of personal advancement, right? But even just calling it scale means that we're measuring something against something else.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're measuring it against is a sort of undefined pool of other people that are out there, right? And how much effect you have on that world and those people.
Yeah. It's a measure of influence, whether that is what you might call charisma or whether it's called brute strength or what have you.
Right. It's your base attack bonus does like a very specific things. It tells you how frequently you're going to hit against a variety of armor classes or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And PBTA is very specific in that it says like when this happens, this other thing will happen, and is potentially a little broader in some ways, but narrower in others. Whereas scale is kind of a little bit between the two of them. It is both more like level, but also it unlocks things for you fictionally within the world.
That makes sense. The way we've talked about scale, for example, when we pull it out to the broader perspective, we're talking about the difference between somebody who is just a good boxer and somebody who has like light body skill and iron body skill and stuff like that, and somebody who can jump from one mountaintop to another and shoot, energy blasts out of their hands or something. We are talking about real, significantly different fictional circumstances when we're talking about scale, as much as we are also talking about a discrete measurement of relative power and ability.
that sort of like orients scale within, a couple of types of games. Let's move on to Wuxia and Power, and we can talk about comparing different groups.
Sure. So the examples that I can think of off the top of my head for comparing or examining Wuxia and Power is that you've got the scale of ability. You've got students on one end and you've got masters on the other. And masters facilitate a student's learning to increase their power, but it's still the case that a student is probably never going to be able to defeat a master without some sort of treachery or some sort of trick up their sleeve. So that's sort of the ability side of power in wuxia stories. You've also got the socioeconomic spectrum here, where on the one side you've got people who are living in slums and the alleyways and that sort of thing, and on the other end you've got people who are living in courts and just totally decadent and concubines for days and what have you.
So are we equating power and scale, or is power sort of go one way on the axis and scale goes another way?
I think it kind of depends. So for example, if you are a student, you could come from a slum or you could come from a noble court. If you are a master, you could also come from a slum or from a noble court. When we're talking about common people, the common people in the slums or if we're talking about NPCs, I guess you could say, the NPCs in the slums and the NPCs in the noble court are going to be existing in a certain hierarchy. And it's going to be very difficult for people who are living in the slums to be able to affect people who are in the courts. But if you are a Shah in the slums, then your personal power and your training can overcome your circumstances in the sort of cultural hierarchy. And you can contend against people and maybe even far outstrip the people who are in the upper echelons of society.
Sure. So we're saying that scale is a thing that can help you disrupt like the normal sort of power balance.
I think so. And some people are naturally going to start off in different points of that power balance. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're going to naturally have more power or less power in one area of life, for example, politics, but then other people who may not have a lot of political power may have a lot of personal combative power or something like that, and they can be a contender on that axis instead of the political axis. Another thing that I want to bring up here that may inform some discussion is that wuxia does not commonly feature a zeroed hero story. It's not going to be the case that you're always going to start off as a student in the slums and then you're always going to end up as a master in the courts, but that is sometimes the case. There is room within wuxia for that. It's just not typically the way that these stories are told. It's a little more finite than that in most stories. People are already starting off in the middle, or people are even starting off at the top, and they grow in power a little bit, just enough to overcome whatever obstacle is presented to them in the story, but they're not necessarily going to go all the way from the bottom all the way to the top. And we've talked about that too in our game design, in the sense that you would decide what tier of power you exist in, and then you move around within that tier. But you're not necessarily going to start off as Ip Man and then end up as Cloud or Storm Riders or something.
Sure. And there is a good tradition of sort of like beggar masters,
mm-hmm.
right? That have a huge scale but like low social power.
Yeah.
But they can cause disruption, right? Because they have this huge sort of personal scale.
Right. And when they reveal their personal scale in a situation where social power is important, the only possible response is, oh, well, we have to attack them because our social power is kind of thwarted by the more immediate threat of violence that they can visit upon us. And so we have to counter that with violence of our own. This is sort of hearkening to the conversations we've had about escalating the consequences of a conflict from words to fists to blades and then to something lethal, So that is an example or a few examples of how power is represented in wuxia stories. And we've already talked about how power is represented in games in the mechanic of advancement. We've seen how yeah, power can increase in wuxia stories, and we've seen how it's not always going to be the same linear track that we see in some games, but I want to explore ways that wuxia is represented in games and see what we can find from these two things that we've discussed so far.
Sure, yeah. So when we look at scale within some other games, one of the ones we've talked about a lot is Hearts of Wulin. And Hearts of Wulin has kind of a fuzzy scale where they're not necessarily strictly defined. It's not like in like Andreas's example of Smiling Proud Wanderer that, oh, I'm number 3 when I'm sitting down, and that's so there's no way that you could possibly beat me. It's more that all of the players sort of exist on a level that is, I think, sort of whatever the tone of the game is sets that scale.
Yeah.
And then the GM sort of by fiat can decide whether people coming in are the same scale, higher or lower than you. But there's no like, I'm scale 3 and you're scale 5, and therefore your scale is higher than mine.
Right.
It's a little more loose.
And that's a really effective narrative lever that the GM can pull. That's how the GM can always be introducing new challenges. It's not like the GM has to sit down and develop a new NPC and write down its stats on paper or something like that. The GM can just say, oh, well, this person walks into the court and they're clearly just radiating this bravado that makes you feel inferior. And that is a sign to the player that this character is higher scale than them. And it can even be explicit, but that's all we need to know. That's all the GM actually needs to present or prepare in order for that to happen. And so the narrative can be really responsive in that regard by not strictly quantifying what the scale of each character is.
Sure. Yeah. It's not like the bad guys have to have like a monster manual stat.
Yeah.
That lists their scale in it.
Yeah. And then from the player character perspective, it means that the player characters don't have to get a success X number of times on a training montage or what have you. It's like, no, what they need to do, if they get defeated, they need to go away, they need to train, they need to uncover some new information, they need to get insight into their opponent, and then whenever they've had a chance to learn something in the story following the fiction, then they can come back and they're on equal footing, or maybe they're even higher scale at this point.
So Feng Shui doesn't really have scale. It does have advancement in that your numbers go up, you gain more shticks, but it's not really framed in that sort of way. I think also partly because it's coming from a slightly different angle.
Yeah, it's a very Western lens on wuxia and Hong Kong cinema.
Right. And that's more, so that gives you more of the like D&D style advancement where you get bigger numbers and like more things.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then the bad guys, I think, progressively get slightly more complicated and more robust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But one of the things about those advancement systems is that it's sort of a sliding scale. You are at a particular level and it's mutable. You can fight things that are above your level and you can lose to things that are below your level. It's just that, you have a reasonable expectation. It sort of adjusts the percentage chance of something happening. Whereas in our conversations, we've talked about scale being absolute. And that's the way it is in Hearts of Wulin as well.
Right. Whereas Feng Shui is basically a level system without a level system.
Yeah.
Because you are quantifying everything, then you have to let sort of the math decide, like, whether this scale is going to beat that scale, whether it's higher or lower, it kind of doesn't matter. You're just down to the vagaries of math and fate.
Mm-hmm.
Wilting the Lotus Empire is interesting because it has established characters that you play. Remember, this is the freeform game that we talked about several episodes ago and that I encourage people to go check out. But it has some established characters, and some of them are royal, and royal means that they have chi powers. Like, that's part of what makes you royalty, is that you have chi powers. So it definitely has characters of different scale within it. But you can still have a conflict between lower scale and higher scale characters. And the thing that makes this interesting is that the players sort of collaboratively get to choose whether these things matter during that particular conflict or not. So I think this sort of like, while it sets up in the fiction that these things exist, it sort of mechanically abstains from deciding whether scale matters. So looping back to the thing that sparked this conversation, which is Andreas's comment that he sent to us, and he talks about how the heavy shadow of D&D falls over all gaming. And I totally get that it is easy to create demarcations and striations where they don't necessarily need to be. So one of the really interesting things that Andreas brings up is something I kind of skipped over earlier, but he talks about how when you make decisions about characters in the world, like even before you play, like when you think about an NPC and what kind of narrative weight they'll have, if you think about your characters' entwined backstories about rival masters and that sort of thing, that if these things have fictional weight, right, like that, you know that this master is more powerful than any other because of the setup that you've done, then maybe you don't need a rule, is kind of how I'm taking what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
Which is certainly compelling, right? It's certainly, that is more on like the PBTA side of things, and it's where the players and the game master can sort of decide how the system is going to engage based on the fictional positioning of what's going on, and sort of what the GM has decided about the NPCs and the relative dangers and powers that are involved. So it is hard to resist sort of like dividing these things into levels.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that it helps give a structure to kind of put this stuff into, and lets us talk about it in a way that gives us kind of something to hang on to, rather than just saying like, oh, well, we made it up, and so therefore that's how it is. It's like, I think there is a little bit more to that. But I think we can talk about how our ideas of maybe about scale have changed.
Yeah.
Over time.
Yeah. Well, and so talking a little bit more about what Andreas is saying, I think so it's like to talk about some movies that we either admire or have actually discussed before. In the later John Wick movies, there's this bounty board. And whenever somebody breaks the rules and they become excommunicado, there is this list that they're put on where their bounty is listed next to them. And if they continue to take out assassins who are coming after them, then their bounty increases. There is no sort of advisory board. There's no oversight in the same way in wuxia stories. It's not like there are people who are tracking the progress of their favorite Shah and quantifying their power level relative to other power levels in the fiction. Even in movies like Flying Guillotine, where there is a tournament that's going on, it's not like there's a ranking system in that tournament. It's like, okay, well, we're going to match up two random people as far as the viewer is concerned, and we're going to, have out that battle, and we're going to see who wins, but we don't even really see like a roster as far as we know in that tournament. And so it makes sense that if we're going to tell a story about wuxia, we need to be careful about including a mechanic that places people along an avenue of power in a ranking system, because that's not really going to serve the fiction necessarily.
So I was just thinking something just now, and then we're talking about sort of a ranking that is sort of like setting wide, doesn't necessarily make sense. But most of the fiction that we've consumed, especially the really ambitious Shah that we see who are interested in competing, like in Swordmaster, one has to beat the other because they've lived in their shadow their whole life. I think scale is almost more of a drive. It definitely has something to do with like personal ability and personal power. But it also has to do with the drive to compare and to see who's better.
And to prove yourself.
And it's sort of a level of ambition. And the higher your scale gets, obviously, it's sort of like a pyramid, the fewer and fewer people that you have to contend against. But it's also fewer people that you have to like prove if no one's testing you, right, you can't really advance.
You're making me wonder, too, about an older idea of scale that we haven't really explored yet, about how as you get more powerful in the martial world, your options are constrained.
Mm-hmm.
And so, on the one hand, we talk about scale in terms of a drive to prove yourself and a desire to become stronger, even if that's not strictly quantified. On the other hand, we talk about how as you become stronger, not only are you facing a reverse pyramid of opposition where you have fewer and fewer true rivals, but you're also facing a situation where your scope of actions are constrained by the power that you have and the way that it can affect the world around you.
Sure, like we saw that in Swordmaster 2, where somebody had essentially reached the top of, they were the number one in the swordplay world, and all they did was have to kill people all day because people kept coming to try and challenge them to take that power, and they were like, I don't want to do this anymore. So they tried to voluntarily shed that scale, and obviously the story shows that you can't do that.
Yeah,
but
you can hide it, but disguises never work out.
Right. They last until they don't. And they always don't at some point.
Right.
So, but that, yeah, I mean, we saw that constraining of personal action when your scale gets high enough.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about a lot of things, and we sort of addressed what Andreas is saying. By the way, Andreas, if you feel like we haven't, let us know, because I would love to continue this conversation. I want to talk a little bit, though, about our work to develop a wuxia game and the evolution of scale that we've seen throughout the course of our discussions.
Yeah, so I think when we started, it felt more like a ranking or a level or something, where we said, we definitely had sort of like some discrete ideas in mind.
Yeah.
Where we said like I'm scale 6, you're scale 6, so unless one of us gains the edge somehow, then chances are good that we either won't do anything to each other or we'll both kill each other. Right? Or if you're Li Mubai and you're scale 10, right, and I'm just a regular guy, I'm scale 1.
Yeah.
Right? There's no way I'm going to beat Li Mubai.
Yeah. Master Bo wouldn't stand a chance.
That poor bastard.
Yeah. But yeah, so at the beginning, we really talked about scale in terms of this absolute and quantifiable thing. We even mapped it onto the 36 Chambers of Shaolin. And over time, we came to realize that no, there are a lot of things that can change your scale. Training can change your scale. Secret knowledge can change your scale. Boosters like the Green Destiny or other techniques or weapons can boost your scale. There are a lot of things that can change it. So it became absolute. It was still the case that if you were a lower scale, you were never going to win. But your scale is fluid now, and it can go up or down depending on the circumstances.
Right. If you're in the blank dojo in the Matrix, right, then scales just is what's going to determine the outcome of that fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But as soon as you start adding different things in there, secret knowledge and all of the things that you mentioned, that's what sort of like tips the scales in one direction or another. And I think that's probably what gives a lot of the conflicts their juice, right? Like that's what makes them surprising and interesting.
Yeah, all of the circumstances that are pressing in on these conflicts.
And
then we've reached a point now, and we have been here for a little while, we just maybe haven't been super explicit about it, where we're asking, okay, well, if scale is fluid, then is it really absolute? And is it something that can be so easily quantified? Because it's really slippery. And if something's slippery, it's harder to grab onto and know.
Yeah, I saw something that DC was talking about on Twitter not that long ago. And this is at Dungeon Commander, and they sort of had this graph of sort of different people's abilities, and they were in bands, right? It wasn't just like a point on a graph. They were bands, right? And so like maybe you're scale 3, but your band is, too high, right? And then somebody else is scale 4 and their band is sort of slightly overlaps with yours, but also exceeds yours,
Mm-hmm.
So this is great podcasting. And so that there is a small range maybe where if you can get your scale up high enough, or you can bring their scale down low enough, that you'll meet.
Yeah. I remember the thread you're talking about now. I think it was in the context of the anime Hunter x Hunter, which I am not familiar with at all. But
Nope.
I think the idea was that there is quantifiable scales 1 through 6, and you've got a character whose worst day is a 1 and whose best day they're a 3, and then you've got another character whose worst day is a 3 and their best day is a 6. So there's just barely overlap between those two characters. And what that means is that if the lower scale character is having their best day and the higher scale character is having their worst day, then the lower scale character has a chance. And I like that idea. But I don't know, talking about Andreas and the real design brilliance of Hearts of Wulin, I think there's something to be said about not quantifying scale.
Really? I came to the other conclusion. No, I'm just kidding. I like it. I am still a fan of it being fixed but fluid.
Yeah.
And because I think it gives you the most room to do something interesting with in terms of like game design. I think it sort of depends on what your game is saying.
Yeah.
Right. And when we talk about this, like our perspective on scale is sort of our perspective. And I don't think that it necessarily is applicable across all wuxia. Right.
Sure.
And there are some cases where the sort of fuzzy scale of Hearts of Wulin is going to work, and then there are some where the absolute scale of 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons is going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And that it sort of depends on like what you're trying to say with your game.
Yeah.
And like what kind of conflicts you're interested in having.
Mm-hmm. Well, for example, Dragon is a great example of a movie where the scale is much more absolute. And Donnie Yen is super high scale in that movie, but his dad is even higher, so high that he can sort of, move the objects around him just by shouting or whatever. And the only way he can be defeated is by getting those acupuncture needles and getting struck by lightning. But he had to have his scale compromised by those needles before he was vulnerable and able to be defeated.
Yeah, I think the idea of an outside ranking is silly. I think it is much more like person to person, like we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. It's a dumb idea, but I love dumb ideas.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a healthy respect for some really dumb ideas, and especially with this one, I understand that in Smiling Proud Wanderer, which is the strongest case we have for a quantifiable scale, that is eventually made fun of in the fiction of that story. But I do also really like the idea of a wuxia world where it's like, oh man, I lost my duel last week, so now I'm only number 5 instead of number 3. This is a bummer.
Right. Yeah, it's Pokemon plus wuxia.
Right.
Yeah.
And it might work really well for, like a more of a sports style wuxia story.
Yeah, for sure.
Like a kickboxing
so it just
story.
depends on what kind of story you want to tell.
Exactly.
So we've talked a lot about scale, but now in a not stupid idea, I just want to thank everyone for listening, and remember to make your kung fu stronger. Thanks for listening. You can reach Eli at ZapDynamic on Twitter or at his website, mythicgazetteer.com. And you can reach me at Eric M. Farmer on Twitter or at my website, dogpoweredvehicle.com. Or you can reach both of us at Jianghu Hustle on Twitter, jianghuhustle@gmail.com for email, and on the Misdirected Mark website. This show is a proud member of the Misdirected Mark Network.